Only 7% of us don't have obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular failure. I wanted to become a dietitian because I had this hope that maybe food could help my brain. I was put on so many medications in the treatment center, and they really just made me drowsy.
But my brain seems to be particularly affected by too many carbohydrates, like my mental health. Can fiber actually be harmful? Is big business, insulin, like I can't, this person I love so much, right? Who was, blood sugar in the 300 range. No discussion, zero discussion about a low carb diet.
In the hospital setting, it's like, if you're diabetic, there's this huge fire. And like you said, your friend came in, we gave you a bunch of insulin to get it back. Okay, we just put the fire out. Okay, now every time you eat, we're gonna set a fire and then insulin, set a fire. And just suggesting like, hey, how about we don't set a fire? Type 2 diabetes is the second most profitable disease to my knowledge, only second to oncology and to cancer. And so it's like, the healthier you make people, the less money you make. It is a business.
Oh, yeah, that's so powerful. And why don't we go there? Hi, friends. If you've ever wondered if there was a diet that could help you lose weight, reduce your risk of diabetes, or maybe heart disease, or improve mental health, today's the day for you because I'm going to interview someone really exciting. Her name's Michelle Hearn. She's a metabolic health dietitian, a former ultra runner, and the author of The Dietitian's Dilemma. And so she's very well-researched, credentialed, and she pushed back against a system that she saw flaws within. And I learned about her work in The Cholesterol Code, a new documentary I highly recommend you all check out if you haven't. But today we're going to talk about metabolic health and the diet that maybe even saved her life, that has definitely improved my health in so many ways. And so welcome to the show, Michelle. I'm sincerely honored to chat with you today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes. Okay. So we're all going to start with just like a few rapid fire questions. And the task is to answer them in just a few quick sentences. And this is just going to give us a preview of what's to come. So first, as a dietitian, what is the worst dietary advice you often hear in hospitals or from most dietitians today?
There's two. Rapid fire, that red meat is bad for you and that everything in moderation is the key to health and longevity.
Can't wait to get into that red meat or the everything in moderation thing. And also red meat. Yes. Someone I love very much just ended up in a hospital. And he was out of control blood sugar upon admission and was allowed soda and 60 grams of carbohydrates, per meal, which I thought was, oh no. Anyway, second one, how do you feel about the new changes to our nutritional dietary guidelines?
I have mixed feelings because I feel like the good is that prioritizing protein. I think that is very front and center. I feel like it's going to be confusing if we don't really teach people about carbohydrates, because if you throw a bunch of protein at people who are severely diabetic without reducing carbohydrate, sugars, and starches, we have another problem. But I think that in general, it's headed in the right direction.
I love it. And I was just listening to your book, and one of the standouts that I thought people would really like is when you do trials where you increase protein and maybe even in a hypercaloric state, or you're eating more calories. If they're coming from protein, you're still not gaining fat in the way that you are from other macronutrients. So I just thought that would be helpful for people. Okay. Are our dietary guidelines evidence-based?
No, I mean, the ones previous, the ones that were just released are not evidence-based. That was one of the most interesting chapters in my book, and we can dive into that. But the combination of, at the time, of politics, religion, and like pseudoscience is very strange.
Yes, we will be diving into that later. I'm really excited. What is the number one test people should use to track their metabolic health?
Gosh, most doctors don't run a fasting insulin. I think that's actually a really good thing to know, because you can, I've had people that are struggling with weight and, they're like, I'm not diabetic. I'm not pre-diabetic. Why do I have all this body fat? You might have really high fasting insulin, and we can talk about what that is and why that matters. But if the things that I would look at, I want to know my A1C, I want to know my fasting insulin, and then I want to know the cholesterol panel. I want to know the LDL, HDL, and triglycerides. And those tell me so much more than a lot of the other stuff.
Yes, I couldn't believe I heard in your book that you had someone with a very normal A1C, which is a 3-month indicator of your blood sugar, kind of like an average, but then had very high fasting insulin. So yeah, they're just different. We'll go into that. And the last one, can fiber actually be harmful?
It can, fiber and once again, it's nuanced. I would hate for people to listen to this and be like, nobody should have fiber ever. There
Yeah.
are circumstances, and we know that the gut microbiota is important. But unfortunately, the advice that everyone needs massive amounts of fiber all the time in every situation is not good advice, in my opinion.
Okay, and one last one. I'm sorry, I just had to ask you because what do you think is the number one or most important thing you wish people knew about food?
Gosh, the first thing that came to my mind just rapid fire is a certain food causes dopamine release, and as I'm a big fan of Andrew Huberman. And the number one thing that I've taken away from all his incredible podcasts, highly recommend people listening to him. He's a neuroscientist. Is you don't want to get dopamine without doing. What does that mean? That means that dopamine is supposed to be released, and it's a good thing. It's supposed to be released when we're um, going towards something important. We are actively like, I'm exercising, I get a dopamine release. I'm engaging in social interactions, I get a dopamine release. I am working really hard on this work project, I get a dopamine release. Well, eating these sugary chips and all these cookies are causing this dopamine release. And it is keeping people eating and eating and eating, even though they're not hungry. A lot of people say, I don't even really like this food. And that is contributing to our like metabolic crisis and obesity. So I think if people really understood that, I think, when people are trying to give these foods up, they miss that dopamine and they don't know what to do. So I think we need to make sure people have other coping skills, other things they can do to be getting dopamine in their life. Because unfortunately, for a lot of people, food is a big driver of dopamine.
Absolutely. Oh, I loved that. Thank you, Michelle. And like I said, I was just captivated by your story, and there were so many, I felt like similarities to me as someone who grew up with an eating disorder and a disordered relationship with food, and actually found something very counterintuitive that paying more attention to certain aspects of my diet actually gave me a freedom. And it gave me a health and it gave me a peace that I hadn't known prior. So take us there. You have a powerful story. So how did you become this dietitian, kind of pushing up against what most people believe to be based on solid evidence, at least the dietary advice that we're getting at most hospitals and from most dietitians today? What's your story?
Real quick, if you know nothing about me or anybody else, I feel like it's very interesting that, we currently, statistically, the estimates are that 93% of the United States is metabolically unhealthy. Like, and that might be a low estimate, meaning only 7% of us don't have obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular failure, some type so things clearly aren't going well, right? But so my story, when I was 12, I was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. I was 5 feet tall, 57 and a half pounds when I was in inpatient treatment. Given a pretty low chance to survive. It was pretty terrible. And now back then, when you didn't have phones, you didn't have the internet. Your parents just basically drop you off and say, "See you in 8 weeks." As an older adult, I'm just like, "Oh my god, it's kind of a big deal." Um, immediately put on a 24-hour tube feeding system. And, it's interesting. There's actually, I've presented before, there's a study they did on individuals with anorexia that I feel like sometimes I'll read a study and I'm like, my 6-year-old niece could probably figure this out. But the people with anorexia had very damaged gastrointestinal systems. The microvilli was not absorbing nutrition. It's like, well,
Mm.
yeah, no shit, right? You're starting to go through severe starvation. And so interesting, you go into the situation, you have a very damaged GI, you're anxious or depressed, you're just this ball of fear, and they immediately put you on a 24-hour tube feeding system that contains corn syrup, maltodextrin, soy protein, and canola oil. And you're expected to eat at that time the standard American diet, which is cereals, all kinds of processed foods. And even today, I've spoken with people recently in inpatient treatment centers. They do these challenges where they have to eat all these cookies and ice cream and these other things, where I'm not saying that people can't ever eat those foods, or we can have another discussion about that. But my question to the system is, everything is nuanced. If you have this massive damaged system, should we be prioritizing? I'm not saying we certainly need to gain weight, we need to get adequate calories and nutrition. but would you be better served doing like very high fat, very high nutrient density foods? I kind of liken it to like, if you crashed your bike and you had like a really bad, like, that road rash, you would never like take a scrub brush to it. Like, no, we gotta let this thing heal. We need to like chill, right? And so, yeah, after inpatient treatment, that did save my life. I did gain weight, but I was, oh man, chronically depressed, anxious. I really struggled through early adolescence and into adulthood. I describe it in my book as kind of like standing on the sidelines of my own life. Like my friends seemed to be able to participate in things and engage. I was constantly worried about, our family's finances and my own nutrition and what I looked like and relationships and other things. I wanted to become a dietitian because I had this hope that maybe food could help my brain. I was put on so many medications in the treatment center, and they really just made me drowsy. But like at that time, I thought like maybe massive antioxidants or something would be able to help. So after I became a dietitian, there's just so many things that didn't really make sense. Feeding, as you mentioned earlier, type 2 diabetics who, can't, their blood sugar is very high. So why are we feeding them carbohydrates consistently throughout the day and then dosing them with insulin? I literally remember asking my preceptor, like, wouldn't it make more sense to just restrict their carbohydrates? And I was kind of pegged as this difficult dietetics student. I was, when I was 24 and we're in the ICU and looking at that, I was like, oh my God, that's the same tube feeding formula. Like this is 12 years later. And now I'm almost 43 and it's similar. I will say they do have much better tube feeding formulas to my knowledge. And I'm happy if somebody corrects me, but those are not covered by insurance. So if someone says, yeah, I want that, you're looking at thousands of dollars over a week, to get that. But I do know home tube feeding people are able to do blenderized and other formulas. Obviously that's best, but it's interesting to me that we haven't evolved to have like, especially if it's somebody's sole source of nutrition.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was it.
That was it. Is there one called Liquid Hope? Have you heard of that?
I have, yeah.
Okay. And it's just the downside is that they're just not covered. It's still kind of an uphill battle.
Yeah, so imagine you're just overwhelmed, you're in the hospital and they're like, yeah, you're going to be billed separately for this. So this could be between, estimating $300 to $500 a day, to have this because you're having people administer it. I don't know. What if you need a couple weeks? Like that could add up real fast.
Yeah, and I don't know. I didn't even plan to ask you this, but I'm just going to ask you because you mentioned it. Are you a fan of seed oils or canola oil? Do you have a big thought there?
I'm not a fan when it comes to, we do know that those can cause inflammation. I kind of think we need to chill on, there's some influencers that if you eat a tablespoon of mayonnaise, you're going to spontaneously combust. I'm like, we need to chill. But I don't think it was interesting when I was an intern, Europe was doing fish oil. All their tube feeding formulas, they had substituted the oils for like the omega-3s. And I was like, well, why don't we do that? And it had to do with it wasn't approved by the FDA. And here we are, fast forward like 20 years later. And, a lot of that comes down to cost, and we can talk about this too, but it's unfortunately, type 2 diabetes is the second most profitable disease to my knowledge, only second to oncology and to cancer. And so it's like the healthier you make people, less money you make. It is a business.
Oh, yeah, that's so powerful. And why don't we go there? Because I've talked to so many people, and like I said, I had an eating disorder myself, and the whole like making me eat cupcakes and food that we know is addictive and is not really like the ticket, I don't think, a diet predominated by it at least, the ticket to the kind of brain health that you really truly need to kind of recover and come out of something like that. It just didn't ever make sense to me, but you've made it out. I've made it out. So there's lots of things that we can do, which we'll talk about. But yeah, talk about that system, that the moment when you kind of realize that dietetics, that there was problems within your field. Take us there.
Gosh, when you're a young dietitian, and I started out my career kind of in more like a supervisory role, but even in the internship, I refused. You don't have to be a member of the Academy of Nutrition, which is the governing board of all dietetics, because back in 2009, the number one sponsors were Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and they say like, oh, this isn't a conflict of interest. I'm like, the heck it is. Are you kidding me? And so that I never liked, but it wasn't until I actually started practicing in acute care that I would just, I saw these things that you would see people come in with, prediabetes and maybe a wound. And then a few months later, now their A1C is already worse and their wound is worse and it's not healing. And I would talk to doctors and other dietitians and they would just say like, hey, look, it's not the guidelines. These patients are just non-compliant. And I would talk to the patients and, of course there's exceptions, but a lot of people seem to really be trying to do well. And so people would tell me like, yeah, I have a salad. I have like, Raisin Bran. I'm doing everything. I'm just hungry all the time. And to me, knowing what I know now, it seems criminal that we don't really educate people on, what foods raise blood sugar, what foods are going to cause an insulin release. All 100 calories of steak is not the same thing as 100 calories of cornflakes, as far from a hormonal standpoint in your body. So yeah, and it was hard because you'd question and you'd ask these things, and I just wasn't really getting the answers that that made sense to me.
Yeah, and that exactly. And there is this focus on calories. Just all calories are the same, and eat everything in moderation. Do you think that's dangerous? And also, where does that kind of hyper focus come from, in your opinion, in the field of dietetics? Why are they so focused on just calories and just moderation?
That's a great question. I don't know specifically. It's so arbitrary because it's like, one, moderation is, ask 10 different people, what does moderation mean? Does it mean I eat this once a year, once a day, once a day? It sounds really good in theory, especially when you're dealing with like any type of potentially like, psychiatric issue, like eating disorders. Like, oh yeah, of course I want to be able to quote unquote be normal and eat in moderation. But you can't, like we talked about earlier, certain foods kind of override the brain and the body's ability to moderate. And so why would we prescribe that? And especially everything is nuanced. You can't tell somebody who's vastly underweight that they should be eating the same as somebody who's potentially like 400 pounds and their A1C is 12. That's really type 2 diabetic, right? So why are we treating these same two people? We really need to talk about, okay, how do we heal you and how do we, and all dietetics, in my opinion, should be keeping inflammation low or stabilizing blood sugar or prioritizing easily digestible, very bioavailable food. That was another thing that I wasn't really taught in dietetics, and I'll define bioavailability for your listeners. What can my body actually use and absorb? I love the example of like, if I say, Autumn, like, hey, let's say I write you a check for $1,000 and you're like, sweet. And you go to the bank and they're like, ooh, she's got like $17 in your bank account. And, oh man, it doesn't matter how much I write you the check for. Can you access the funds? That's going to bounce on both of our, hopefully not now. If I only had $17, but that's what it is in food. Just because you look at the back and it says spinach has all this iron, your body cannot use and absorb that. It's effectively useless to you, right? So if we teach people, and once again, this isn't me saying don't ever eat spinach if you love spinach, but we need to be very aware. As humans, I feel like we should really prioritize these highly bioavailable foods. Once again, depending on your goals, and I feel like I have to say that more carefully because I get people messaging me. If you're someone who's really, really underweight, you probably have a bigger allowance of the things you can eat, as far as how many calories. But most of our society is not that way. Most of our society is desperately looking for answers for weight loss and health and energy, and focusing on those blood sugar stabilizing, highly bioavailable foods is life changing. And I want to say real quick too, like, I had patients that were diabetic. They're like, oh, I've been diabetic for 30 years. I'm talking type 2. I worked with a gentleman, 6 months ago or so. His A1C was 10.2, anything over 5.7. 5.7 is pre-diabetic, over 6.5 is type 2 diabetic. So he's 10.2. That's not good. 71 days, his A1C went down to 5.4. 71 days. So crazy. Why do you have type 2 diabetes for 30 years? It's because we're not going to medicate or moderate ourselves out of this metabolic crisis. We have to shift how we're eating.
Yeah, and one other thing that was, and I love the discussion around animal products and their bioavailability and how our nutrition labels they don't do us justice. And I think that word's getting out there, but like iron, 2 to 3 times more bioavailable in animal products, zinc, and you go through this beautifully in your book. Calcium, you have to drink like 16 cups of like raw spinach or like a glass of milk. It's absolutely crazy. But the other thing before we go on to, what's happening in the body when we lose this blood sugar control, is big business, insulin. Like I can't, this person I love so much, right? Who was, blood sugar in the 300 range when he came into the hospital. No discussion, zero discussion about a low carb diet, which we know there's evidence for, right? Like you're saying this, you work with people all the time. It was just here, don't have more than 60 grams of carbohydrates, and then let's get you on insulin. So why? Do you think it's just big business?
What is why?
Yeah, what's going on?
I feel like my life, and I this isn't hyperbolic, really changed when I read Eric Westman's paper on therapeutic carbohydrate restriction as a first line of defense against type 2 diabetes. Because when I read the line that they got somebody off, I think it was 150 units of insulin in like 8 days. I was like, that's impossible. That cannot be done. Like I read this paper over and over again. And, I reached out to Dr. West, like he's on the American Diabetes Society with me now. Yeah. So here you are, like you said, in the hospital setting. And what's so funny is when you said 300, the first thing that came in my mind is like, it's not that bad. We see people with like 400, 500. The worst I've seen, I think, was like a little over 600 first thing in the. And of course, let me say, if you do come in the hospital and your blood sugar is 600, we do need to get you insulin so you don't die. But then from there, I think a take-home message is the body requires 0 carbohydrates to function. If my carbohydrate, like glucose load, is super high, and I don't need any to function, we have essential fatty acids. We need fat in our diet. Essential amino acids. We have to get these from proteins. There's no essential carby acid. And once again, this is not me saying that you should never have some carbs and fiber, but if you are in this nuanced type 2 diabetes, we need to chill for a minute. It's kind of, to me, in the hospital setting, it's like, if you're diabetic, there's this huge fire. And like you said, your friend came in, we give you a bunch of insulin to get it back. Okay, we just put the fire out. Okay, now every time you eat, we're going to set a fire and then insulin and then set a fire. And just suggesting like, hey, how about we don't set a fire? Doctors and nurses freak out. Oh no, we have to have carbs. That is a incorrect message. And once again, I'm not saying you can't ever have carbohydrates. I'm saying for now, we need to chill. And then I will also say that a lot of patients are addicted to carbohydrates. You tell them like, hey, we can't have your soda. I'll never forget, I had a woman, I did a contract stint in long-term care. And, woman bedbound, drinking like a 2-liter soda a day. And I said, I'm going to just call her Miss Smith. I said, hey, Miss Smith, we can really help your blood sugar just by cutting the soda. And she put her arm on my arm and she said, you take my soda, I'll break both your arms. And if I was being funny, I could have stepped away and said, well, you got to get out of bed. But seriousness of that is the addictive. Once again, she's so addicted. There's her only dopamine hit in life. She's living bedbound. So that's another reason, because we are getting pressure from patients, and it's very, very hard.
And that makes sense, right? You have to meet people where they're at. So not everybody is going to be willing to limit their carbohydrates, and that's fair, right? I think insulin has its place. And in your book, I think I read that if you took everybody and put them on a low carbohydrate diet, like the top 3 food companies and insulin companies would basically like lose a large percentage of their market share and of their profitability in just a handful of years. Yes?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because insulin is an incredibly powerful drug. And as someone who one of my nephews has type 1 diabetes, like I'm not saying I don't want insulin to be made, but once again, using it could be used judiciously. And I mean, that's what it was really designed for. It was designed for, oh my gosh, these kids that don't produce any with type 1 diabetes, and giving it to people where, once again, most people can start producing insulin again. And we can reverse your type 2 diabetes. We can resensitize your pancreas to insulin. Like, that should be the goal. And it doesn't have to be like an all or nothing. It doesn't have to be my overall experience. Most people do much better kind of stepping out, working with them gently, but everybody, in my opinion, deserves to be taught this, to be given this option. Say like, hey, if you want to keep taking insulin and eating this way, that is your prerogative. These are the side effects. People don't also explain to people, like, this doesn't end well. Type 2 diabetes, you're going to have most likely you have a 2 to 4-fold risk of heart failure, of limb amputation, all kinds on your eyes, not a guy come in once in acute care that it stepped on a piece of glass, but he didn't know for 7 days because he had no feeling in his feet. So he was septic. This doesn't go well. So that's an option, or we can chill on the carbs and do better.
I love that. I love that. And I read that in your book too, that amputations often end in higher risk of mortality too, right? So, I mean, not only is it completely life-changing, but so before, like I said, we're going to go to what's happening in the body with diabetes, but you opened up a can of worms right there in that Dr. Gary Fettke was doing diabetic amputations, and he got turned into, I'm sure you know him. Do you know of his work?
I do know, yeah.
Yeah. So like you said in your book too, that people can't with heart disease or the restrictions on animal products, you can have carbohydrates, but ordering animal products is kind of frowned upon or suggesting them. Where did this fear originate? You had a whole chapter in it. Can you give us the highlights? Where do our fear of meat really come from?
Well, so when we're looking at cholesterol, like if you're looking at a cholesterol panel, most people hear the word LDL or low density lipoprotein and are immediately associated with bad. I mean, unfortunately, if you Google what's the bad cholesterol, it'll probably say LDL. Cholesterol is so important. You can eat, all, and your body and brain will make it. Like, it's so important for your hormones, for cell communication, for your immune system, has all these functions in the body. And, it's really been demonized. And so what happened is they were, especially in the 70s, they were looking at like occluded arteries. So they're looking at like plaque, and you look at plaque and you see LDL. And so they said, oh my gosh, we know that when you eat a lot of saturated fat, these animal products, your LDL increases. And we're seeing these LDL plaque in arteries. So this is the whole correlation causation. Doesn't necessarily mean one thing is the other. The question should have been why. Why is LDL? Because we know that we have, people throughout history, especially like the Inuit Eskimos that have been eating seal blubber and oil that have very high LDL, people eating a lot of animal products. We also have meta-analysis, really large, over 100,000 people studies, especially as people age. Higher LDL is associated with less risk of infection, less cognitive decline. A lot of people can say, yeah, my grandparents ate bacon and all this stuff, and they were much better than us. So you have to have something happen, because if not, LDL is like doing its thing in the body. Something has to happen for it to get stuck in an artery. And, the number one cause, you have to have some kind of inflammation and oxidation. And of course, there's some there's autoimmune things. There's a few things that can cause that outside of type 2 diabetes. But type 2 diabetes is hyperglycemia over time, this massive amount of inflammation. And some people will argue too, like a massive amount of vegetable oils contributes to that as well. But certainly, we know that heart disease is really closely connected. I mean, if you watch the cholesterol care, they were showing that. They're like, hey, metabolic disorders, way higher risk, all this insulin resistance of causing heart disease than just high LDL. And so kind of the take home isn't that like LDL doesn't matter, because it does, but you don't want to look at it in a vacuum. Like it's important to say, like, if you have really high LDL, how are your arteries? Maybe get a coronary artery scan if you're concerned. That's a relatively easy test to do now, because a lot of people have been scared off of doing these lower carbohydrate diets for fear of, oh my gosh, my LDL is going to go up. What's my risk of heart disease? But I think the overall evidence of that being an issue, and I appreciate that the movie and Dave Feldman's research is, it depends. Certainly, it certainly could, but it's not the main driver of heart disease.
Yes, it's overly simplified. And I loved the part in your book where you went through this infection risk and how people with higher levels of cholesterol actually did better when it comes to infections and when it comes to dementia and related outcomes. And I'm a lean mass hyper responder, which is why you are too. I figured you would be because you were in the film. But just lean mass hyper responders are people who have metabolic health, right? They aren't insulin resistant. They're not overweight, and that yet they have what is traditionally believed to be high levels of cholesterol. And I don't know if you want to share the results or how you got involved in the project or what it found, but kind of like what you were saying is it's really nuanced. But for people with metabolic health, what are the outcomes? What does it look like when you still have elevated cholesterol?
Yeah, so the Cholesterol Code is a documentary on Amazon. We're honored if anybody checks that out. But kind of the take home message was Dave Feldman, who's an engineer by trade, was asking the question, does increasing LDL necessarily lead to plaque buildup? Because he was super overweight, follows a ketogenic diet, loses weight, is feeling great, but he noticed a massive increase in his LDL. And then as he's like reaching out to other people, he's seeing people that reverse lifelong depression, schizophrenia, that all these people healing, but some people having, their doctor being like, "You've got to stop this. Your LDL is going off the chart." And so the question that the documentary is asking is that going to cause plaque buildup? And so, they had a bunch of people do these, the coronary artery scan before, either, I think they were several years into ketogenic diet and then a year later and looking at the plaque. And I want to say it was 94% of people that had no changes, or some people actually had less plaque, and to be fair, yeah, I believe there was one or two people that did have an increase in plaque. So once again, you're going to have, I think the Cardiology Association had to point that one person out. But the take home message being it's not you can't just look at it in a vacuum, and if we have this way of eating that could potentially help people with anxiety and depression and some of these major mental health issues, could help with weight loss, could help with energy, could help with blood sugar stabilization, and we're scaring people off from the increase in cholesterol, that might be not justified.
Yeah. And the story that really stuck out to me was the little boy with epilepsy. It's like, these are brain seizures we're talking about. And are we going to eat carbohydrates, get the brain seizures back just because of elevated cholesterol that may or may not actually affect risk for anything later? So yeah, I highly recommend you guys check that out, because the research is exciting. And for people like me who have slightly elevated cholesterol but have seen the benefits with more high animal products, ketogenic lifestyle, lower carb. I'm not keto, but it's a very interesting deep dive. And so I think they ended on some metrics. Actually, let's wait for that. Let's go into what happens in your body when we're 93% of us are metabolically unhealthy, pre-diabetic. That being, define that for us. What does that mean, metabolically unhealthy, and what's happening in the body?
On a very, very layman's simple level is I think a lot of people are walking around just tired, over fat, not sleeping well, have kind of a baseline level of stress and anxiety. A lot of people don't even know how bad they feel. It's amazing. I don't know if you experience this too. People, once they change how they eat, they're like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't even realize how tired I was." Like, it's amazing how much better I feel. And a lot of people, depression is the number one cause of disability worldwide. We have even our young humans are struggling with depression and anxiety. So from a metabolic standpoint, what I often see in people is an increase in, blood sugar, fasting blood sugar, an increase in A1C, which is a measurement of their blood sugar over time. We see an increase in triglycerides and usually a reduction in HDL, which is, the high density lipoprotein. Gosh, interestingly, the patient population I got an opportunity to work with in the Bronx, New York, I saw an interesting correlation where their blood urea nitrogen levels were really low and their blood sugar was really high. And blood urea nitrogen is, BUN is a kidney function lab. And, we tended to really focus on that in the hospital when it was high. And that means, kidney function. But seeing that over and over, I'd ask people like, "Are you eating protein? Are you eating any protein?" Yeah. You rarely see it low, And no, they're eating like a lot of chips and cookies. They're literally eating such little amount of protein and so much starchy carbohydrates that you have this huge discrepancy. And so, I really like the graph. I think it was Diet Doctor originally put it out, that just shows the impact of the 3 macronutrients on normal blood glucose. If I eat a carbohydrate, what does it do to my blood glucose? If I eat a fat, what does it do? If you eat protein. And you can just see the difference is stark. You get this huge rise in blood glucose with carbohydrates, and then with protein, it's very, minimal, and with fat, it's almost completely neutral. And so, to me, you can use that information, to improve your health. Say like, okay, if I'm someone who's overweight, if my blood sugar is too high, I need to focus on the things that are going to stabilize my blood glucose. That seems like pretty logical. It seems like that's what we should be teaching. That's what we should be, but it's not. We continue to teach people to eat, carbohydrates several times throughout the day. And it's fine if you want to eat cereals or cookies or whatever, where, if you are having carbohydrates, in my opinion, really focusing on those higher, more whole food carbohydrates is the way to go. But if my blood sugar was high, let's just say like I had type 2 diabetes, first priority is protein, fat, and maybe some like fibrous vegetables. I'm having zero carbohydrates till we reverse this.
I love that. Thank you for that. That's beautiful. And for someone like me, who I've always been, normal weight, lower end of weight, but my brain seems to be particularly affected by too many carbohydrates, like my mental health in particular. So can you talk a little bit about that too? So, higher waist to ratio, or like higher waist, or like more belly fat, essentially higher blood pressure, right? Higher blood sugar, all the markers that you've been mentioning too. But I think like brain health is something that people don't often associate with insulin resistance or prediabetes. But can you talk about that link too?
Yeah, it's interesting because we didn't used to even think that like the brain had insulin receptors, and people like you or I, I'm a relatively, lean human as well, could go into a doctor, we get our labs run, and we just say, look, I'm struggling thinking, I'm really depressed. And, they might give us, do some labs. Everything looks normal. Here's Lexapro. See you in 6 months. Not helpful, right? Not helpful. And then you just, and God help you, let's say you start taking like Lexapro or another prescription, and it doesn't help. Then you start to think like, oh my gosh, am I just going to be messed up forever? So what we know is that for some people, they just don't metabolize glucose very well in the brain. Why that is, that we don't know. We don't know. But, honestly, I kind of found that I don't really care. When we're able to use a different fuel substrate, when you follow these lower carbohydrate diets, as opposed to depending solely on glucose in the brain, you start to feel the ketones. You have a different fuel. It's kind of like if your brain needs regular unleaded and all you're doing is diesel, I mean, yeah, of course it's not going to work. So when you're switching to this other fuel source, if that is something you struggle with, a lot of people are like, wow, I'm thinking clearly. I notice for myself, I'm like, I'm kind of calm. I could just sit there and like, I was much more present with people. It was totally wild. And so, now there's even like ketone supplements and things you can certainly, it's kind of an interesting experiment. Sometimes people will just use one of those and be like, oh, wow, I have this mental clarity. It's like, you might need to look into a low carb diet, your brain is really liking this. Yeah. And I think that gives a lot of people hope, let's say, like I said, you've been dealing with anxiety or depression or racing thoughts. It's like, wow, what if I just shifted my macros? Sometimes people like, we can talk about this. Oh, it's so restrictive. It's like being able to think clearly, being able to be present, being able to have the energy to chase your goals and dreams and participate in life is not restrictive.
Oof. And just so well said, because I feel that, right? Like people would look at, my diet is just less, I guess less inclusive of processed foods or, birthday cake but after years of doing it, I don't even miss it. It's like, it's not even hard to say like, oh, I don't want to eat cake because I just I don't feel like I normally feel when I don't eat cake. And so I think over time it's just you just see the benefits and you don't want to go back. But okay, so what are the research too in metabolic psychiatry? That's something that really excites me. My aunt was bipolar. And I know, like you said, sometimes we just have like a genetic defect where we can't utilize maybe glucose related fuel as well as we can ketones. But what are you seeing in the metabolic psychiatry world? Is there any research around eating disorders, like you kind of alluded to before?
Yeah.
Schizophrenia, bipolar, like what is exciting you in that world?
I mean, the work of Chris Palmer, Georgia Ede, Sati Shabani, and so much of this, just the Bizuki Foundation with Metabolic Mind has really been a huge driving force of this, because it's hard to do research because it's expensive. And if it's not going to end with take this pill, it's almost impossible to get funding unless you have private funding. So very big shout out to, the Bizuki group for funding these, but they're showing like, man, one of the pilot studies, they actually showed in 6 weeks, there was shifts in the brain. They did MRI scans with people with major schizophrenia. And on a ketogenic diet, they saw changes in 2 different areas of the brain. And that's, fascinating. And there's a great case study that Sati Shabani did on binge eating disorder and ketogenic diets. And 3 different individuals had complete remission of symptoms. And they also had statistically significant reductions in anxiety and depression, which was interesting. I talked to her about this. It's kind of a side note. I would have highlighted that. But I mean, the big thing obviously is remission. They all also lost weight. They were, grade 2 obesity or above. But the fact that, this wasn't like, oh, I've been struggling with the eating disorder for 6. I mean, this was years of people struggling. And to me, what a shame that they weren't even introduced this option. Like, hey, why don't we, and when you talk about restrictive too, a lower carb diet, you're eating delicious food. You're eating a lot of meat and fats and, vegetables and other things. You're getting enough calories, you're getting enough nutrition. You're just not including a lot of the processed things as carbohydrates. And I think a lot of the world struggles with that. Once again, because we get so much dopamine and so much, it's probably one of the most socially acceptable addictions.
Yeah.
I think I said, if I was in a work meeting and I pulled out a bottle of wine and started drinking, I would be escorted out. But if you're in a work meeting and you eat a cupcake, it's just whatever, even as a dietitian, right? So, it's very interesting to me that in society, we haven't really put more emphasis on that. And I will say, I think too, that if you're following a very high carbohydrate diet, as I was before I shifted, it is very hard those first few weeks, Although interestingly, sometimes I have people tell me it's not as hard. It was hard for me.
Yeah, it was hard for me.
I felt genuine withdrawal. Am I gonna claw my eyes out? Because sweats, shakes, all kinds of things. Because your system is changing and adjusting, and you're just used to that chocolate chip cookie or all these dopamine hits. So I do validate that changing how you eat is incredibly difficult.
It's absolutely. And I, like you, had fainting spells when I was in high school. I think you might have had one. I had several, and I attribute it to that just perpetual roller coaster I was on. I genuinely think my brain was starving and my blood sugar was creating a lot of inflammation, widespread inflammation. The other thing I want to say right before we get practical, because we're just going to go into what do you eat? How do you do it? How do you track it? Is I loved this. I think it was Shabani Sethi that did the trial with people on medication for schizophrenia and bipolar, and the fact that they not only improved metrics of psychiatric health, but also metabolic health, which is another thing that medications, psychiatric medications, psychotropic medications, they often negatively impact. So I think it's just it's like a twofer. It's you can feel good medically. Yeah, right?
And I should say that, I've had a very honored to have the opportunity to work in several mental health facilities as a head dietitian. And, I wish I could bring the skills I know now, but even, back then, several years ago, my goodness, those patients are fed so much sugar. And like you said, the medications often come with weight gain side effects increasing. It is not uncommon for people to go in with major psychiatric issues. And if they're in a hospital for several months to come out 20 to 30 pounds heavier. So it's well, now you have these major mental health issue and your blood sugar's high. Have a good day. That's not ideal, right? And so the idea that we can really utilize a nutrition protocol, and I've been fortunate to speak personally with Chris Palmer, and he has said several times one of his ultimate goals is this is an option. This is really presented, to parents, to caregivers, to patients if they have capacity. Once again, people have capacity to say yes or no, but let's talk about this. Would you rather do this versus, maybe another option that might be less effective?
Yeah, I'm really excited for that day. I think that day's coming. So let's get practical. Michelle, what are you eating? How do you start something like this? What are the, major sources of carbohydrates that you think potentially getting rid of would be the most impactful? Where do we begin?
Yeah, let's say you're listening to this and you're just oh my gosh, I am severely anxious. I think it's good if you can to get a baseline. When I say get a baseline, you're I don't want to go to my doctor. There's some great websites you can get on. I've used ULTA labs, and you can literally just buy a lab panel, go, they'll tell you where to go. It'll show up in your email the next day. I do that for my iron a lot as an athlete. Just so you can see this is where you don't necessarily have to. But it's also very important if you are on any blood sugar lowering medication, you've got to work with your doctor, because you can't be taking insulin and eating low carb. That is very dangerous. Right. But let's just say you're not on any blood sugar lowering medication. Maybe you're a little overweight or you're just anxious and you're what do I do? There's some great, I am terrible when it comes to recipes and stuff. Thankfully, my partner likes cooking, but I'm very boring. But making sure you get enough protein, fat, and if you into like the non-starchy vegetables, you can totally do that. I think having 3 meals a day where you really structure. I always tell people too, like, what do you like to eat? It does me no good to just make you a random meal plan if I'm like, oh, let's eat eggs. I hate eggs. But for example, a lot of people do, they'll start their day with some type of eggs, something higher in protein and fat. A lot of people lean into those ruminant animal being like beef, elk, lamb, bison, using some butter, using some, healthier fat. And butter has not been considered a healthy fat. If you talk about saturated fats, yeah, butter, coconut oil, if you like olive oil. And then, it's very common, like a traditional keto diet might be like eggs and vegetables, so some burger patties, vegetables or salad, and then like chicken thighs, cream sauce, asparagus, the end. Once again, it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be fancy. There are great sites and books with recipes. Like I said, I'm very boring, but I found for myself, and I'm still training for running, eating more animal protein really helped me get enough calories, and I do incorporate carbohydrates. I kind of use them strategically more around my running. A lot of athletes will do that. But my diet is pretty easy. It's pretty boring. I enjoy a couple, I do use a few supplements, but mostly just ruminant animal meat, some vegetables, a little bit of seasonal fruit, do some sourdough, and that's about it.
That's it. Oh, you do sourdough. I love that. So would you say you're keto, or would you say you're like low carb?
No. I mean, traditional keto, I believe, 5% of carbohydrates are less. And some people, for me who runs, you can actually eat more carbohydrates and still be in ketosis because of the exercise. But no, I would say, because when I'm really training, I mean, I'm running up to 80, 85 miles a week. So I'm taking carbohydrates post run, during really long runs, and then usually in the meals. I mean, it's definitely less than like a traditional endurance approach. And I've kind of played around with it, should I have more? And it's kind of, it's, I'm always willing to grow, change, and evolve. But for me, I found that I'm happier staying on the lower carbohydrate end.
Yeah. What is that lower carbohydrate end? Do you like track your grams? And then do you recommend wearing a CGM? Would that help someone kind of dial in their perfect carb threshold, or like how do you recommend we dial it in?
It can. I had a company give me one several years ago. We're just like, hey, we wear it and talk about it. And I was kind of surprised, because what a CGM does is it'll tell you like what foods you're eating, how they're impacting your blood sugar. It's you, because everyone's a little bit unique. As my nephew is a type 1 diabetic, so I love, we have access to his blood sugar on an app. So anytime I was watching him when he was growing up, you could just be like, oh my God, what did he just eat? Just go super high, but even things like a banana, you can see it just, go really high. Once again, this is a type 1 diabetic. But yeah, I think that can help. I think if you're just really want to get kind of down to the nitty gritty, I think it's never a bad idea just to kind of start low, and it once again depends. Like if you're like, hey, I'm just dealing with anxiety, or I need to lose weight. If you need to gain weight, I'm not necessarily sure it's a great idea to eliminate all carbohydrates, as you kind of want a little bit of that insulin response, I think can help. So yeah, I mean, and that's where maybe working with like, and thankfully now there's a little more dietitians that are familiar with ketogenic diets can help. But yeah, no, I was fascinated. I think the thing that spiked my blood sugar the most, I just had like chicken and rice, and that white rice is really spiked my, because you have it, so you have to go play around. I would have thought that like eating I think I had like a half a donut or something. Not as much as the chicken and rice. I was like, wow, white rice.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah, more so than, and then so much of the protein and fat, it was just straight as a board, so, and you can even tell a lot of people kind of intuitively know, they're like, oh yeah, if I have like, steak, or if I have something, like I'm full, but if you have a plate of pasta, you're like, oh man, kind of a few hours later or whatever, you're hungry again.
Yeah, some of my most valuable experiences have been using my CGM and anything liquid, like liquid sugar. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that will just send me into a range. And also I noticed I can actually have more bread than I thought I would be able to. So you can find both good and bad. It's just kind of a portal into you. But what about like, how would we know our blood sugar is getting out of range just based on like the way we feel? For me, I can tell when I'm irritable. I also tend to get like a little bit shaky, but like what signs would people be able to recognize?
I mean, I think that's the number one. I think a lot of women kind of excuse that, but you also shouldn't have to eat every 2 to 3 hours. Like if you eat at noon and you're having a panic attack at 3:30 because you don't have something and you're kind of like dizzy, shaky. I used to feel this way. That like that's not good. That's not normal. And I was also like very lean. That is your body being like blood sugar is too low. So like you're saying, you're kind of chasing it. Then you have a granola bar, and then it's high, and then 2 hours later it's low, and then it's high, and then it's low. That's also very inflammatory on your body. You're going to produce cortisol and adrenaline and all kinds of things. Like what you want to do is be able to eat and just be nice and stable, until your next meal. I mean, the human body, we used to fast for days. And so it's like, I remember in the hospital, I have patients be like, I haven't eaten, since this morning. And it's like, it's noon. Like, we're cool. Like, but when your blood sugar is really dysregulated, you constantly are hungry and you're constantly dizzy and sweaty. Your body just isn't. So yeah, if you're feeling like you're tired all the time, if you're feeling like at 2 o'clock you need a nap, certainly looking at blood sugar, certainly if you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, if you're fasting, insulin is high. Those are certainly signs. If you feel like if you go to do any type of even like working out, even like, hey, I go for a walk and I'm just exhausted. It's like, no, those things aren't normal. So those are things too that can be really improved over time. And also I really appreciate that you said you noticed that when you do liquid sugar, I have very strong opinions on like a lot of those liquid sugars. I think if you're, I used to tell my patients, and this is maybe me being a little snarky, but like, oh, are you running a marathon? Like, why are we drinking apple juice? Like it's very interesting to me that, if you're, and there are cases where people genuinely need to gain weight or their calorie needs are astronomically high. In that case, let's pull that lever. Like I said, if you're anorexic and you're really underweight and under body fat, yeah, let's pull that lever. Have a glass of apple. Let's go, But once again, that is a very small percentage of the population. If you are overweight, just cutting out liquid calories, sodas, iced teas, these coffee drinks that are really just sugar, that alone can really, really change. It's frightening how much sugar we consume just through sugary drinks.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I noticed that it was so profoundly different than other foods for me. And what about protein recommendations? How many grams are you working with a day? How many grams should people be aiming for a day? Because protein kind of turns off that appetite and that kind of like insatiable need to just be snacking too. So do you use that a lot?
Yeah, and I think protein is also one of the foods that is so nutrient dense. It's when I say nutrient dense, it's really high. One of the few foods it's really high in like the B vitamins and also a lot of trace minerals, because people are like, oh, I'll just drink a protein supplement, which in certain cases that might be okay, but I'm one whole foods first, because your protein supplement, it's not going to have like carnitine and carnosine and all the amino acids that just like a steak or ground beef or, seafood or, chicken or other things are going to have. And like you said, they're incredibly satiating. And so I found that a lot of people are afraid, they're like, oh, I had 2 eggs this morning and a tiny bit of chicken. I'm like, you can double that. All of a sudden it's like, wow, I'm not as hungry. Wow, I feel much better. We're really taught to limit protein, which is very strange because if you're having, let's just say 2 eggs and 3 ounces of chicken, okay, well, congratulations, you've got 35 grams of protein and you need like 100 or 120. What are you going to do? You like 2 ribeyes tonight? So making sure having people have a higher amount of protein earlier in the day, I found really helps people not eat so much, especially later on at night. And so just doing that, saying like, hey, I'm going to have more eggs, I'm going to have leftover from the day, having those protein foods, people naturally tend to eat quite a bit less. And your body's also really good at utilizing protein. Like we said at the beginning of this, there's lots of studies that people slightly, overeating the amount of protein that potentially they need, they don't gain, body fat. And of course, there'll be someone that comes back, oh, what if you drink, 200 grams of whey protein? Okay, I'm sure you can drink We're talking about eating actual whole foods. So there's just a really good, I mean, the body's so smart. We do all these things to override it, but when you have these real whole foods, especially the proteins and the healthy fats and vegetables, it's pretty hard to overeat.
I love it. And one question I wanted to ask you too, have you ever used amino acids? Like, are you familiar with Julia Ross's work
Yeah.
around? Oh, you're not. Okay, well, I'm just really interested. She uses individual amino acids for, food addiction and other types like depression very successfully. And I've always wanted to combine a low carb keto diet with potentially, strategic amino acid supplementation. I thought that would be just so powerful. I was just wondering if you're familiar. But now, last thing, um, what do we track? Like to make sure that we stay in that metabolically healthy range? What are you tracking? What metrics do you think are the most impactful for people to look at over time?
Yeah, and so like full disclosure, I don't track now because I've been doing this for
Yeah,
quite a while. But I do
yeah.
think when you first start, and I just said something that I was like, I feel like I need to clarify, that I said it's really hard to overeat. It is not hard to overeat fat.
Yeah.
Like let's say if you're very, let's say you're dealing with obesity or type 2 diabetes and you want to lose weight, it's a lot of people are like, all right, I'm just going to start eating lots of butter, lots of oil. Like that's not necessarily the goal here, right? Because you want to actually use some of your own body fat. You can burn that for fuel. So I really encourage people to kind of like get a baseline. Like, okay, let's say I'm just going to throw out a hypothetical. You work with somebody and they're like, all right, your weight loss is 1,800 calories. And so then you can kind of delve that out. Okay, what does that look like if I'm eating, 70% fat, 20% protein, 10% carb? And then you can kind of, plan that out meal wise. And then you might be surprised, we've been doing this forever. The other day, my wife was like, oh my God, I didn't know this yogurt like has this much fat or something weird. I was like, how do you not know? We've had that forever. Once you do stuff for a while, you kind of get, a feel for it. But I do think it's good to get a baseline because if you just kind of say, oh, I'm just going to eat meat and fat, you might you know, be eating tons of fat where you really should be eating a little more protein, or maybe even in that case, a little more like add some, vegetables for a little bit of fiber. I don't know. So I do think tracking for like, let's just say hypothetically, like 3 to 5 days, especially if you kind of find out like, these are the meals I like, this works, these are about the portions. And even just like sitting with it, like, yeah, I'm totally full and fine. Or it's like, gosh, I still feel a little hungry. Okay, well, maybe I have a little bit more protein or a little bit more of something else, versus just kind of like, well, I guess I'll just have a stick of butter. And like, that might not be the best thing for your fat loss goals.
No, I love that. I love that. Thanks for that clarification. So yeah, and one last on the food piece too. Fiber. How do we know? Because we have a big carnivore following for our YouTube channel too. And so which fiber-rich foods would you work with if they don't seem to be working with you? What are the most tolerable, maybe the lowest in anti-nutrients? What are you working with? Let's just
Yeah, what do I work with? I am a big fan of like one, we have a small garden, and so we do like greens and red like green beans and things like that. But I think especially if you're super inflamed, it can be nice to just go like pure carnivore, really easy target in the fiber for a while. But I have found that, especially fermented things, if you're doing like a little bit of kimchi, I mean, cultures have been doing this forever, right? Various, different cultures, a little bit of sauerkraut, those tend to digest really well, and those tend to have be more bioavailable when it comes to the vitamin and minerals they have. And so I'm pretty simple. I do some carrots, I do, when she has green beans, we'll do a little bit of fermented vegetables. Some people like, mushrooms. That's a kind of a big foraging thing in this area that I live in. But I also think it's a little individual. Like sometimes people are like, yeah, I can eat a salad. I'm totally fine. Some people are like, oh, I eat that. And a lot of GI issues. So I do think it's a good thing. I used to be like, it doesn't really matter. But I feel like Dr. Bickman and them show me more research that fiber can be, can potentially be beneficial. So I would lean into like, find a few things, find a few different plants that maybe you potentially like. And just like, a lot of the starches I eat, like I'll eat the sourdough's fermented, if you feel like, yeah, my body doesn't digest this at all, maybe start with just a small amount of like a fermented vegetable. And, yeah, that's what I would do.
I love that. Okay, Michelle. Well, this has been so much fun. I'm trying to think. I think we've talked about everything I wanted to talk about, but if I want to give you a chance, is there anything else you think people need to understand that you think we left out of this conversation?
Geez. I mean, I kind of always like to kind of wrap things up by saying, like, the human body and brain have a tremendous capacity to heal. I think we often, I know when, before I changed how I ate, I was like, is this the best it gets? Like, you're down, you're depressed. You think, like, really changing how I eat can have this profound impact? It really can. And also, I like to tell people that, we've unfortunately been really spoiled with like Amazon and Google. And, I ordered something online that was from somewhere else. And I'm like, it's 24 hours. Why isn't it here? What the hell? It's like the human body is not Amazon or Google. It takes time. So you really have to give yourself some patience and some grace and consistency. Like that's the only way to do anything great. And you can see this in other areas in your life. You can see this if you have a business or a family or relationship. It's like time on task every day. That's what makes you great. So, I would really encourage people not to try this for a day or two and be like, oh, this doesn't work. Like say, hey, you know what? Let's give this a good month. Let's give us 30 days of consistency. I'm going to be patient. I know it could be a little rough transition. Yeah. Hope everybody, tries this if this is something that's interesting to you and curious on how people do. I'd love to hear feedback.
Yeah, well, and last thing, tell us, because it's, food was the gateway for you, and you seem to, at least from your book. There's probably a lot of other tools, lifestyle things that you do. So maybe tell us where we can connect with you if people have questions, and then take us through like a day in your wellness-based strategies and lifestyle. What are you working with besides food?
Sure. So my website's a little under construction, but it's still up, thedietitiansdilemma.net. You can email me directly through there. I am on Instagram, just my name, Michelle_A_Hurn, HURN. Technically on X, but there's a lot of arguing on there. So those are probably the two best places to find me if you have questions. So yeah, a day in the life of me. There's a couple things that I think have really helped outside of nutrition is, when I get up in the morning, the first thing I do after I get the coffee making going is I set a timer for 10 minutes and I read. And then I flip it over. It's just one of the timers and 5 minutes and I just meditate. I do that before. I don't get on my phone. I don't do whatever. It was really hard at first. And I also have made a commitment to myself I do not worry about things I cannot control. I have no control over the events of the world. That doesn't mean I don't care. I care passionately. But I also refuse to be outraged. But what can I control? I tell people this all the time. And someone reach out to me. They're so concerned about somebody. So what do? I focus on my health, So after that, I'm out the door for a 8 to, depending on the day, 20-mile run. I have a wonderful German Shepherd. I love on him at least once a week. I have a little more time lately, so twice a week the last few weeks. I volunteer because I promise you guys, it doesn't help your community or the world to argue with a friend on Facebook, but your community desperately needs. Like I volunteered at a food pantry. It was Monday. I spent 2.5 hours chopping zucchini and then serving homeless people. This isn't me here to judge. So what if instead of like, arguing over this or that or what if we just said, you know what? I'm going to go work at the Humane Society an hour a week. I'm going to go make sure that I go to the gym. I'm going to be the best version of me and I'm doing something to serve my community. That's kind of how we change the world. So that's really helped my mindset because if not, you just, on social media and this and that, and the world's going to hell in a handbasket. It's like, once again, I can't control that. So anyway, those are the big things that I do is I love on Jackson the German. I run, read, meditate, volunteer when I can. I have a wonderful partner that we make sure every night we get to, have dinner and chat together. And I do prioritize sleep. I love sleep. People are like, oh, I get 5 hours sleep late. Not me. Yeah. Call me at 9. It's going to be on Do Not Disturb unless it's, very rare occasion. And yeah, just in general, obviously I have my dietetics practice that I do. So that's my day job. But I just, in general, I try to be as positive as possible too. How we look at the world really impacts our mental health.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Michelle. This has been wonderful. And clearly you have a lot of tools and I love the volunteering aspect and not sending more videos that fuel outrage to your friends, but instead.
And I'm embarrassed to tell you, Adam. I remember once and not only did I argue with this dietitian, I seethed over it. I wasted a whole day being like, thinking about how stupid she was, how mean she was. A whole day of my life I wasted about something on social media. And that's still, to this day, I'm like, I can't believe I did that. no more. My energy, like, go to helping myself, other people. Those are the two things. And it's amazing how much more peace I feel doing that.
I just wiser words have never been said. So everyone, go check out the cholesterol controversy, the dietitian's dilemma. You also have a YouTube channel that I checked out too. So
Thank you.
I'll put all the links below. And again, thank you, Michelle. Your wisdom and your excitement around the topic is infectious, and I'm just grateful that we got to have this conversation.
Too. Thank you so much.